Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. Edward here. Tell me, have you ever trusted a record simply because it looked official, a signature, a seal, a number in its proper place? Watson learned that even the tidiest ledger may hide an altered page. Do subscribe so no forgery escapes your notice. Now, look closer, for as Holmes reminds us, truth rarely announces itself. It waits to be found. Join us on the Watson's Margins Spotify channel. Link below. Chapter 1. The Gentleman in the Fog. It has often seemed to me, in setting down these records of my friend Sherlock Holmes's career, that the character of a London fog bears some curious relation to the character of the crimes it so frequently attends. There are fogs which merely inconvenience the traveller, and there are fogs which seem to settle upon the conscience of a city, muffling not only sound but truth itself, so that a man may walk within a yard of his neighbour and never know what passes in his heart. It was such a fog, thick and yellow and pressing close against the windows of our sitting room in Baker Street, that lay over London on the evening when Dr. Edmund Harcourt first came to us with the singular affair of the switched asylum release order. I had returned to my old quarters that November for a fortnight, my wife being away at her sister's, and I confess I had settled into the familiar chair by the fire with something of the old contentment, watching Holmes as he bent over a chemical apparatus on the side table, his sleeves rolled back and his brow furrowed in that particular concentration which no interruption, however urgent, could easily break. The bell rang a little after 8, and I heard Mrs. Hudson's step upon the stair, followed by a voice, low and troubled, asking whether Mr. Holmes might spare a few minutes for a matter of the gravest importance. "A physician, unless I am much mistaken," said Holmes, without lifting his eyes from the retort before him. "You will notice, Watson, that the tread upon the stair is quick but uneven, the hesitation of a man accustomed to command in his own sphere but uncertain of his reception in another. Show him up, Mrs. Hudson, by all means." Our visitor proved to be a man of perhaps 45, well dressed in the sober fashion of his profession, with the clean-shaven, careful face of one who has spent years cultivating the confidence of anxious families. He introduced himself as Dr. Edmund Harcourt, physician to Blackthorn House, a private asylum standing some miles beyond the northern outskirts of London. His hand, when he removed his glove, trembled slightly, and he accepted the chair Holmes indicated with the air of a man grateful to be permitted to sit at all. "Mr. Holmes," said he, "I come to you upon a matter which threatens not only the reputation of an institution to which I have devoted the better part of my professional life, but which touches, I fear, upon something considerably darker than mere administrative error." "Pray begin at the beginning, Doctor," said Holmes, settling into his chair and pressing his fingertips together in the attitude I had come to know so well. "I find that physicians, of all my clients, are the most inclined to diagnose before they have properly examined." Harcourt permitted himself a thin smile at this, and then his face resumed its former gravity. "3 days ago," he said, "a patient of ours named Arthur Bellamy was released from Blackthorn House. Bellamy had been with us for 6 years, confined after a severe mental collapse following the death of his elder brother Charles. The release was entirely in order so far as our records were concerned. The discharge document bore my own signature, that of my colleague Dr. Felix Morland, and the counter-signature of our superintendent, together with the institution's seal and proper registration number. I saw the man leave the grounds myself quite calmly in a cab summoned for the purpose. And yet you are here," Holmes observed, "because yesterday morning Sir Malcolm Vane, who chairs the board of Blackthorn House, informed me in the plainest terms that no such release was ever authorised. He denies all knowledge of it. Dr. Morland, when I telegraphed him, denies having signed anything of the kind. And Arthur Bellamy, Mr. Holmes, has vanished entirely. No one has seen him since he stepped into that cab." Holmes's eyes, which had been half closed, opened fully at this. A forged document, then, executed with such skill that 3 separate signatures, an official seal, and a correct registration number were all successfully counterfeited. That is no mean achievement, Doctor. Tell me, who among your establishment had access to such particulars? Harcourt considered. Myself, of course, and Dr. Morland. Sir Malcolm, naturally, in his capacity as chairman. Our records clerk, Mr. Silas Crane, who has maintained Blackthorn's papers for 15 years without the smallest irregularity. And I suppose one must mention Mrs. Lydia Bellamy, the patient's widowed sister-in-law, who has petitioned repeatedly for his release, and who might, I confess, have motive enough to forge such a document herself, however unlikely I find the notion. Inspector Lestrade has already begun his inquiries, though I fear Scotland Yard regards the matter as a simple case of a clever lunatic contriving his own escape. And this Mr. Crane, said Holmes slowly, what manner of man is he? Oh, quite unremarkable, Mr. Holmes. Mild, punctual, almost invisible in his habits. I do not believe I have heard a single complaint against him in all the years he has served us. He is precisely the sort of man one forgets is in the room. I saw a curious light come into Holmes's grey eyes at these words, though he said nothing further upon the subject, turning instead to question Harcourt closely upon the physical particulars of the release order, the hour at which it had been received, and the exact wording of the covering letter. It was not until our visitor had gone, swallowed once more into the fog from which he had emerged, that Holmes spoke his mind. An invisible man, Watson, said he, standing with his back to the fire and regarding me with that expression of suppressed eagerness which I had learned to associate with the scent of a genuine problem. I have long observed that the men whom the world takes least trouble to notice are frequently those most worth the noticing. Pack a bag, my dear fellow. I rather think Blackthorn House will repay a visit. Chapter 2. Blackthorn House. The fog had not lifted by morning, but had rather settled into a grey, persistent drizzle that seemed to seep into the very upholstery of the cab as we rattled northward out of London. Holmes sat opposite me in silence for the better part of the journey, his hat pulled low, and his eyes fixed upon the passing hedgerows with the abstracted stare of a man turning some problem over and over in his mind, examining it from every possible angle, before committing himself to a single conclusion. "You are unusually quiet, Holmes," I ventured at length. "I am considering the peculiar arithmetic of invisibility," said he without turning his head. "A man who has gone 15 years without a single complaint against him has either lived a life of perfect rectitude, Watson, or he has taken very particular pains that no complaint should ever be lodged. I find myself unable as yet to say which. Blackthorn House, when at last we came upon it, proved to be a severe Georgian pile of blackened brick standing well back from the road, behind a screen of winter-stripped elms, its iron gates closed and forbidding, as though the building itself wished to discourage curiosity. A porter admitted us upon the presentation of Harcourt's card, and we were shown through echoing corridors, smelling faintly of carbolic and old paper, to the consulting room of Sir Malcolm Vane. Sir Malcolm proved a heavy, florid gentleman of perhaps 60, with the confident bearing of a man long accustomed to having his opinions accepted without challenge. He received us with a courtesy that struck me as somewhat forced, as though he regarded our visit as an unwelcome intrusion upon matters he would rather have settled quietly among his own people. "I can tell you very little that Dr. Harcourt has not told you already, Mr. Holmes," said he, seating himself behind a broad mahogany desk. "Arthur Bellamy was a prosperous solicitor before his collapse. His elder brother Charles died suddenly some 6 years ago, and the shock appears to have unhinged him entirely. He developed delusions of persecution, imagined conspiracies against his family's affairs, and was eventually certified and brought to us by his own relations, who could no longer manage him. As to this release order, I can only say that I never signed it, never authorised it, and never received the smallest intimation that such a document existed until Bellamy had already vanished." "You have examined the order itself?" Holmes asked. "I have. It appears, upon the surface, entirely genuine." Sir Malcolm produced the document from a drawer and passed it across the desk. Holmes took it with the delicate care of a man handling a rare specimen, and I leaned over his shoulder to observe it with him. It was a formal paper of the sort I had seen many times in official correspondence, bearing Harcourt's flowing signature, a second signature which I took to be Dr. Morland's, a third and more official hand which the superintendent's countersignature evidently represented, and, stamped firmly at the head of the page, the seal of Blackthorn House itself, together with a registration number 4176, entered in a neat clerical hand. "A remarkable piece of work," Holmes murmured, holding the paper to the light. He said nothing more upon it, folding it carefully and returning it to Sir Malcolm, though I observed that his eyes had lingered rather longer upon the registration number than upon the signatures themselves. It was at this juncture that the records clerk was summoned, at Holmes's request, to bring the relevant ledgers. Mr. Silas Crane proved to be a slight, grey-templed man of perhaps 50 years, dressed with the neat, unremarkable precision of a man who has long since ceased to attract attention to his appearance. He carried a stack of ledgers and correspondence registers with the practised ease of a long habit, and answered Holmes's questions regarding the asylum's filing system with a fluency that left nothing, so far as I could judge, to be desired. "Every release is entered in sequence, Mr. Holmes," said he, indicating the ledger with a thin forefinger. "Each order receives a registration number as it is processed, and the number is entered here in this column, alongside the date and the attending physicians' names. We are most particular about it. Sir Malcolm insists upon strict accuracy in all our records. An old correspondence, is it ever destroyed? Never, sir. Everything is preserved. We have papers here going back 30 years and more." Crane smiled faintly, as though the question amused him. "You will find us a most orderly institution, whatever appearances may presently suggest." I confess that I found myself entirely reassured by the man's manner, and said as much to Holmes when we had withdrawn to examine the ledgers alone. He made no reply, but continued turning the pages before him with a slow, deliberate attention that seemed out of proportion to their apparent contents. "You will observe, Watson," said he at last, "that Mr. Crane's fingertips bear the faint violet stain of copying ink, of a variety somewhat different from that used in these ledgers before us. You will observe also that his right cuff is a shade newer than his left, which suggests a recent and perhaps hurried replacement of a soiled garment, and there, upon his watch chain, a brass key, polished with a freshness that its fellows do not share, as though it had lately been in more frequent use than its worn appearance would otherwise suggest. You think him concerned in the affair, then? I think nothing as yet. I observe merely. But observe this, Watson." He turned back several pages in the release ledger, until he came upon the entry recording Bellamy's discharge, and beneath it, running his finger along the binding, indicated a page whose edge, upon close inspection, showed the faintest discoloration of fresh gum where it met its neighbour. "This page has been repaired, not torn accidentally and mended in the ordinary course of wear, but removed, and returned to its place with some care. Whether Mr. Crane knows anything of this, I cannot yet say. But I should like very much to know why so orderly an institution should number among its most carefully kept records a single page that has, within recent weeks, been taken out and put back again." He said nothing further, closing the ledger with a soft final sound, and I saw upon his face that expression of quiet, contained excitement which told me, better than any words could have done, that Sherlock Holmes had already begun to see, however dimly, the shape of the truth that lay beneath Blackthorn House's placid surface. Chapter 3. The Empty Room. Bellamy's former quarters lay at the end of a long corridor upon the second floor, a small but comfortably appointed chamber, whose barred window looked out upon the bare elms and the grey November sky beyond. It had stood untouched, so Harcourt assured us, since the morning of his departure, the staff having been instructed by Sir Malcolm to leave everything exactly as it was pending the outcome of the police inquiry. Inspector Lestrade was already there when we arrived, standing in the middle of the room with the satisfied air of a man who has settled a matter to his own complete satisfaction and is merely waiting for the rest of the world to catch him up. "Ah, Mr. Holmes," said he, "I rather thought you might find your way out here, though I fancy there is less to the business than Dr. Harcourt supposes. It is a simple case, when you come down to it. Bellamy forged the order himself, walked out under his own arrangement, and is now, if my information is correct, somewhere in the county of Kent." "Indeed," said Holmes, with an air of polite interest that I had long since learned to distrust. "You have evidence of this?" Lestrade produced, with something of a flourish, a small collection of papers taken from a drawer beside the bed, an old newspaper cutting, yellowed and much handled, describing the circumstances of Charles Bellamy's death, and several sheets covered over and over with practised repetitive handwriting, evidently an attempt to copy some particular hand. "You see for yourself," said the inspector. "The man has been teaching himself to forge a signature. It does not take a detective to draw the obvious conclusion." Holmes took up the sheets and studied them with care, holding first one and then another to the window light. "The obvious conclusion," he remarked, "is not invariably the correct one, Lestrade, though I grant you it possesses the considerable advantage of requiring no further labour to establish. Tell me, where precisely were these papers found?" "In the drawer there, beneath some linen, not concealed then, merely tucked away in the ordinary fashion of a man's private effects. Concealed enough, I should think, for a man in an asylum. And yet," said Holmes, "a man clever enough to forge 3 signatures, a seal, and a registration number with sufficient skill to deceive the very physicians whose names he copied, would surely possess the elementary cunning to burn a few sheets of practice paper rather than leave them where the first attendant to search his room must certainly discover them. It is a very great inconsistency, Lestrade, to credit a man with such extraordinary finesse in one particular and such extraordinary carelessness in another." Lestrade's confidence wavered visibly, though he recovered himself with the air of a man unwilling to abandon a comfortable theory without a struggle. "Lunatics are not always logical in their habits, Mr. Holmes." "No," Holmes agreed, "but forgers of this calibre generally are." He set the papers aside and began a slow, methodical circuit of the room, examining the floor, the window frame, the small iron bedstead, with that peculiar crouching attention which I had seen him bring to bear upon 100 such investigations. I busied myself meanwhile in conversation with Lestrade regarding the porter's report of a man resembling Bellamy having been seen boarding a train at a station some miles distant, a piece of intelligence which had evidently done much to confirm the inspector's theory of a self-arranged escape. He was travelling alone, Lestrade told me, dressed respectably, and answered generally to Bellamy's description. A tall man, clean-shaven, with grey at the temples. The porter cannot swear to it absolutely, the crowd upon the platform being considerable, but it is suggestive, Doctor, you must allow that. I allowed it readily enough, and indeed found myself, as I had at Blackthorn's records room, inclining once again toward the official view of the matter. So plausible did it appear when set out in the inspector's plain, sensible fashion. It was Holmes's voice, low and sharp with sudden interest, that recalled my attention to the room itself. "Watson, come here." He was kneeling beside the wardrobe, a heavy oaken piece set against the inner wall, and indicated with a lean finger a place upon the floor where the dust, thick everywhere else in the unused chamber, had been disturbed in a curious pattern, as though something had been dragged from beneath the wardrobe's lower edge. "A box, perhaps, or a case of some kind," he murmured, half to himself, "kept concealed beneath the wardrobe and withdrawn upon the morning of his departure." He drew from his pocket a small lens and examined the disturbed dust more closely still. "You will notice the marks are old at the edges and fresh at the centre, which tells us the object had lain there undisturbed for some considerable time before it was finally removed." A further search of the chamber, conducted with a thoroughness that left no corner of the small room unexamined, produced 2 further discoveries. Behind the cold radiator beneath the window, Wedged into the narrow space between the pipe and the wall, Holmes drew out a small fragment of red sealing wax, no larger than a shilling, and folded within it a torn corner of heavy cream-coloured paper, of a quality altogether superior to the plain stationery which Harcourt had earlier informed us was supplied to the patients of Blackthorn House for their private correspondence. "This is not asylum paper," said Holmes, holding the fragment to the light between finger and thumb. "The weave is too fine, the colour too rich. This has come from elsewhere, Watson, and it has been very deliberately hidden where a diligent searcher, but not a careless one, would be certain to discover it." "You believe it was placed there," I said, "for us to find?" "I believe," Holmes replied slowly, folding the fragment into his notebook with great care, "that we have been presented throughout this room with a most convenient trail of evidence, handwriting practice left where any attendant might stumble upon it, a torn scrap of superior paper tucked just carelessly enough to reward a thorough search, and nothing whatsoever, in either case, that a genuinely desperate and calculating man would have left behind him. It is a very tidy story, Lestrade, that Arthur Bellamy has told us in this room. I confess I find myself wondering who precisely has taken such trouble to tell it." Chapter 4. A Dead Man's Name. The report from Kent, when it reached us the following morning by telegram, seemed at first to lend considerable weight to Lestrade's theory of a self-arranged escape. A railway porter at a small station beyond Maidstone had come forward to say that a man closely resembling the missing Bellamy, tall, clean-shaven, greying at the temples and travelling without luggage of any consequence, had taken a ticket upon the very afternoon of his disappearance. The local constabulary had been alerted, and a search of the surrounding villages was already underway. "You do not seem greatly moved by this intelligence," I observed, watching Holmes fold the telegram and set it upon the mantel, with an indifference that struck me as almost perverse, given the apparent importance of the news. "A tall man, clean-shaven, with grey hair, travelling alone upon a winter afternoon," said he. "You will find several thousand such men within 20 miles of London on any given day, Watson. I do not say the porter is mistaken in what he saw. I say only that what he saw proves considerably less than Lestrade supposes it to prove." He took up his pipe and settled into his chair with the air of a man dismissing a minor distraction in favour of matters of genuine consequence. "I have spent the morning more profitably, I think, among Blackthorn's older archives, and I have found there a small discrepancy which interests me a great deal more than the movements of an unidentified traveller in Kent." He drew from his pocket 2 sheets of paper, copied in his own careful hand from documents in the Asylum's records room, and passed them across to me. Both purported to record the funeral arrangements of Charles Bellamy, Arthur's elder brother, whose death 6 years before had precipitated, according to the official account, his brother's collapse into madness. The first, drawn from the admission papers completed at the time of Arthur's confinement, gave the date of burial as the 11th of March. The second, taken from an insurance correspondence file, preserved among the Asylum's general records, gave the date as the 15th. "A discrepancy of 4 days," I said. "Surely a clerical slip, Holmes. Such things happen constantly in matters of record-keeping." "They do," Holmes agreed, "and I should think nothing further of it, Watson, were it not that everything else in this case suggests a system of records kept with the most scrupulous, almost obsessive accuracy. We have been told, and I believe truthfully, that Blackthorn House preserves every scrap of correspondence for 30 years and more, that every release is numbered in strict sequence, that nothing is ever lost or misplaced. An institution capable of such precision does not commonly permit a 4-day error to stand uncorrected in 2 documents pertaining to the very event which precipitated its most significant case of the decade. I confess I found the point a fine one, and said as much, though I own that Holmes's instinct for such small inconsistencies had proved itself too often in the past for me to dismiss it lightly. We had little further opportunity to discuss the matter, however, for our morning was interrupted by the arrival of a visitor, whose name Mrs. Hudson announced with some hesitation, as though uncertain of the reception a lady arriving unescorted and in evident distress might properly receive. Mrs. Lydia Bellamy proved to be a woman of perhaps 40 years, dressed in the plain black of a widow of modest means, her face marked by the particular weariness of one who has fought a long battle against indifference and delay. She seated herself upon the edge of the chair Holmes offered her, and came to her business with a directness I found immediately sympathetic. "Mr. Holmes," said she, "I have read in this morning's paper that my brother-in-law is believed to have forged his own release and fled the country, and I tell you plainly that I do not believe one word of it. Arthur was never mad, Mr. Holmes. Melancholy, yes, and grieved beyond measure by Charles's death, but never mad, not as they mean the word. You visited him regularly during his confinement, as often as I was permitted, which was not so often as I wished. I petitioned Sir Malcolm for his release upon a dozen occasions, and was refused upon a dozen occasions, always with the same soft, regretful phrases about the necessity of caution in such delicate cases." Her voice, which had been controlled until this point, took on a sharper edge. "I believe, Mr. Holmes, that Arthur discovered something shortly before his confinement, something disgraceful, connected with the family's affairs, and that he was silenced for it. He said as much to me himself in the weeks before he was taken away, though he would never tell me what it was he had found. He said only that it concerned money, and that certain gentlemen would be ruined if the truth came out." "Have you any notion which gentleman she means?" I asked, when Mrs. Bellamy had paused to compose herself. "I have long suspected Sir Malcolm Vane," she said quietly. "He had business dealings with my late husband's firm many years ago, before Charles's death, and I have never been satisfied as to their nature. It would not surprise me in the least, Mr. Holmes, to learn that he arranged Arthur's confinement to protect himself, and that he has now arranged his removal for the very same reason. It was, I confess, a theory that seemed to gather a most uncomfortable plausibility as the lady spoke, and I saw that Lestrade, when Holmes communicated the substance of the interview to him later that afternoon, received it with an eagerness that bordered upon relief, as though a solid and respectable motive had at last been supplied to a case that had hitherto offered him nothing but loose threads. "There is your answer, Mr. Holmes," said the inspector when we met him that evening at the yard. "A man with money troubles years ago, a family that knew too much, and now a forged order to remove the one witness who might yet expose him. I mean to have a look into Sir Malcolm's financial history without further delay." Holmes said little in reply, though I observed, as we walked away together through the gas-lit streets, that his brow remained clouded with a dissatisfaction he did not trouble to conceal. "It is a very comfortable theory, Watson," said he at last, "and I have generally found that the theories which arrive most comfortably are precisely those which repay the closest suspicion. Sir Malcolm may indeed prove a scoundrel, but a man may be guilty of a great many things, my dear fellow, without being guilty of the particular thing with which he is charged, and I confess I have not yet satisfied myself that anyone in this affair has troubled to ask the right question. And what question is that? Not who had reason to hate Arthur Bellamy," said Holmes, "but who had reason to wish him believed a forger and a fugitive rather than simply dead or simply free. There is a very great difference, Watson, between removing a man and constructing, with such elaborate care, an explanation for his removal. I begin to suspect that the explanation has cost someone a great deal more ingenuity than the removal itself." Chapter 5. The Men Who Signed Nothing. The following 2 days Holmes devoted to a series of interviews conducted with a thoroughness that left, so far as I could judge, no possible avenue of inquiry unexplored. I accompanied him upon most of these expeditions, and though I confess the details of handwriting and signature seemed to me at the outset a somewhat narrow foundation upon which to build so large a structure of suspicion, I came in time to appreciate the patient logic by which Holmes assembled his case, fragment by fragment as a mason builds a wall. Dr. Harcourt received us again at his consulting rooms in Wimpole Street, and repeated with every appearance of sincerity that he had examined Bellamy on numerous occasions during the preceding months, and had indeed begun to entertain hopes of his eventual recovery, but had never once recommended in writing or otherwise that he be released. "I would have signed such a document gladly, Mr. Holmes, had I believed the time was right," said he, "but I had not yet reached that conclusion, and I certainly never set my name to any paper authorizing it." "You're quite certain the signature upon the release order is not your own?" "I have stared at it a dozen times since this affair began," Harcourt replied, with a weariness that seemed genuine enough, "and I confess it gave me a most uncomfortable turn, Mr. Holmes, for it is a very close likeness indeed. But no, it is not mine. There is a small looping flourish I give to the final letter of my surname from long habit, which the forgery does not reproduce." Dr. Morland, whom we ran to earth at his club that same afternoon, proved a brisker, less reflective man than his colleague, and dismissed the matter with something approaching irritation. "I was in Brighton, Mr. Holmes, attending the annual conference of the Medico-Psychological Association, upon the very day this document is supposed to have been signed. I can produce a dozen witnesses to the fact, and a hotel register besides. Whoever forged my name did so without my knowledge, and I resent the imputation that I should have any part in so shabby a business." It was the superintendent of Blackthorn House, however, a cautious and somewhat colourless gentleman named Pierce, whose testimony Holmes seemed to find of the greatest interest. Pierce, examining the countersignature attributed to himself, confirmed what the others had already told us, but added a detail that caused Holmes to lean suddenly forward in his chair. "It is a very accurate copy, Mr. Holmes," said Pierce, turning the document beneath the lamp. "Accurate to a fault, if I may put it so. My signature has one small peculiarity, which few would trouble to notice, still less to reproduce. I pause, from an old habit of carefulness, before certain downward strokes, so that the ink pools very slightly at those points. You will find the same pooling here, in the forgery, at precisely the same letters." Holmes examined the point with his lens for a long moment in silence, and I saw, when at last he straightened, that same quiet light in his eyes which I had come to recognize as the herald of significant progress. "You have given me something of real value, Mr. Pierce," said he, "though I think you scarcely realize its importance yourself. A forger who merely copies the shape of a signature reproduces its outline. A forger who reproduces its hesitations, its small unconscious habits of pressure and pause, has studied that signature not once, but many times, over a considerable period, with specimens enough before him to learn its rhythm as well as its form. This is not the work of a man who obtained a single sample and laboured over it in secret. This is the work of a man who has had years of access to the genuine article." It was upon our return to Blackthorn House that afternoon that Holmes requested, in a manner so casual that I confess I did not at first appreciate its significance, that Silas Crane furnish a few lines of his ordinary handwriting upon the pretext of comparing it against certain entries in the older ledgers whose authorship was in question. Crane complied without the smallest hesitation, writing out several sentences of no particular consequence in a small, neat, entirely unremarkable hand, and passing the page to Holmes with what struck me as genuine indifference. "There, Mr. Holmes. I hope it answers your purpose." Holmes studied the page briefly and thanked him, and I observed, when Crane had withdrawn, that the clerk's handwriting bore not the smallest resemblance to the confident, flowing forgeries upon the release order, a fact which I confess struck me at the time as conclusive evidence in the man's favour. "There, Holmes," I said, when we were alone once more. "Surely that clears him entirely. A man cannot disguise his hand so completely as to leave no trace whatever of his natural formation of letters." Holmes made no reply for a long moment, turning the sample over in his fingers with an expression I found difficult to read. "A man cannot disguise his ordinary hand, Watson, when he writes in his ordinary hand," said he at last. But a man who has spent 15 years copying documents in a professional capacity may very well have cultivated more than one hand, each suited to its purpose, as a musician may play in several distinct styles without confusing one for another. I do not say this proves Crane guilty. I say only that it proves rather less than you suppose. That evening, seated before the fire with his pipe and a sheet of paper upon which he had sketched, in his small, precise script, the movements of every person who might conceivably have entered Blackthorne's records room during the days preceding Bellamy's disappearance, Holmes fell into one of those long silences which I had learned neither to interrupt nor to resent. "Consider what the official theory requires of us, Watson," he said at length, laying down his pen. "It requires that a man confined for 6 years, permitted only the most limited correspondence and the most careful supervision, should nonetheless have obtained specimens of 3 separate signatures, sufficient to reproduce not merely their shape but their unconscious peculiarities, that he should have duplicated an official seal, that he should have mastered a numbering system known only to the institution's own clerical staff, that he should have altered a bound ledger without detection, and that he should have accomplished his own removal from the premises without the assistance of a single confederate. It is, I confess, rather a great deal to ask of a man whom everyone assures us has spent the better part of a decade in a condition of settled melancholy. I begin to think, Watson, that we have been asked to admire the wrong magician, while the true performer stands quietly at the edge of the stage, applauding with the rest of the audience." Chapter 6. The Secret in the Ledger. It was upon the 4th day of our investigation that Holmes returned to Blackthorne House alone, a circumstance sufficiently unusual that I remarked upon it when he came back to Baker Street some hours later, his boots grey with the mud of the country road, and his expression that of a man who has spent a profitable morning among matters too dry for ordinary company. "I have been reading a very old story, Watson," said he, settling into his chair and stretching his legs toward the fire. "Though it is told, as such stories generally are, in the dullest possible language, and buried among a quantity of correspondence that no one has troubled to examine in years, it concerns Arthur Bellamy's activities in the weeks immediately preceding his confinement, and it interests me a very great deal." He drew from his breast pocket a small notebook, filled with his own careful transcriptions, and read to me, by way of illustration, portions of several letters which he had discovered among the asylum's older files, letters written by Arthur Bellamy himself to his own solicitor's clerk, in the months before his collapse, requesting particular financial records connected with the estate of his late brother Charles. He was investigating something, Watson, and investigating it with the persistence of a man who suspects a very particular wrong. There is a missing page, moreover, in an old ledger belonging to Bellamy and Bellamy, the solicitor's firm which Arthur and his brother jointly conducted, a page which, from the surrounding entries, appears to have recorded a transfer of funds belonging to Charles's widow, made shortly before her own death some years before Charles's. "Money belonging to Charles's widow," I repeated. "And Charles is now dead, and the page is missing. It begins to look very black indeed for Sir Malcolm Holmes, does it not? He was trustee for several of the Bellamy family's investments, was he not?" "He was," Holmes agreed. "And I do not doubt that Lestrade will find his inquiries into Sir Malcolm's financial history a fruitful field of labour. But I found something else this morning, Watson, which I confess interests me a great deal more than Sir Malcolm's old debts." He paused, and I saw upon his face that particular stillness which in Holmes generally preceded some observation of unusual weight. "I found, buried among the earliest employment records of Bellamy and Bellamy, the name of a junior clerk who served the firm for some 3 years, until his sudden departure some 7 years ago. The clerk's name, Watson, was Silas Croft. I confess the name meant nothing to me at first hearing, and I said as much. "Silas Croft," Holmes repeated patiently, "who left the employment of Bellamy and Bellamy under circumstances the firm's old correspondence describes only as irregularities in the accounts, and who reappears some months later in the records of Blackthorne House as Silas Crane, records clerk, a position he has held with unblemished credit for the 15 years since." The effect of this intelligence upon me was considerable, and I own that my first impulse was to regard the matter as very nearly settled. "Then it is Crane after all," I exclaimed. "He worked for the very firm whose funds went missing. He changed his name, and he has spent 15 years in a position affording him complete access to Arthur Bellamy's confinement and, ultimately, to his release." "It would appear so," Holmes said with a caution that struck me even then as somewhat more pronounced than the evidence seemed to warrant. "I confronted him with the fact this morning, and I will tell you honestly, Watson, that his response was not without a certain plausibility of its own. Crane, it transpired, had made no attempt to deny the connection once Holmes laid it before him. He had explained, with every appearance of embarrassment rather than alarm, that he had indeed been dismissed from Bellamy and Bellamy for negligence in the keeping of certain accounts. A foolish error, he insisted, rather than any deliberate wrong, and that he had adopted the name of Crane upon seeking his present position, purely from a desire to escape the shadow of that early failure, which he feared might otherwise have cost him a respectable situation he had come, in the years since, to value very highly. He wept a little, Watson, when he spoke of it, Holmes said, with a note in his voice that I could not quite interpret. He begged me to consider what such a disclosure might mean for a man of his years and modest means were it made public without cause. It was, upon the whole, a most affecting performance. You do not believe him? I believe every word he told me may very well be true, Holmes replied, so far as it goes. A man may indeed be dismissed for negligence, and may indeed adopt a new name from motives of pure and understandable shame, without being guilty of forging release orders or engineering the disappearance of a former employer's brother. I put to him one further question, however, Watson, to which I received no satisfactory answer whatsoever. And that was? I asked him why, if his change of name arose simply from a desire to leave an unhappy episode behind him, he should have adopted the name of Crane some several months before he ever applied for his position at Blackthorn House, rather than at the moment of his dismissal itself, when the shame he describes would presumably have been freshest and the motive for concealment strongest. Holmes leaned forward, his eyes bright with the particular intensity he reserved for the moments when a case began, at last, to yield up its true architecture. A man who changes his name the day he loses a position has fled a disgrace, Watson. A man who changes his name some months later, after a period during which he has evidently done something with those months that he does not care to account for, has very possibly prepared himself for something else entirely. Crane, pressed upon this single point, had grown first confused, then evasive, and had at last retreated into a repetition of his earlier explanation, offered now with rather less conviction than before. Holmes had pressed no further, content, as he explained to me, to let the question stand unanswered for the present, like a loose thread left deliberately untugged until the whole fabric might be examined at leisure. "There is a story here, Watson, larger and older than a single forged order," said he, rising at last and crossing to the window, where the lamplighters were already at their evening rounds along the darkening street. "I do not yet see its full shape, but I begin to suspect that Arthur Bellamy's confinement 6 years ago and his disappearance 3 days since are not two separate crimes at all, but the opening and closing chapters of one very long and very patient design. Chapter 7. Sir Malcolm's Ruin. Lestrade arrived at Baker Street the following evening in a state of scarcely concealed triumph, his hat still upon his head, and his coat glistening with the damp of the street outside. So eager was he to communicate the results of his inquiries that he had, I think, scarcely paused to knock before Mrs. Hudson admitted him. "Well, Mr. Holmes," said he, seating himself without invitation, and producing a bundle of papers from beneath his arm, "I fancy we have got to the bottom of this business at last, and I will own it is not quite the bottom I expected when we began. It is Sir Malcolm, right enough, though the shape of it is older and uglier than a simple forgery." He laid the papers before us with the air of a man displaying a hand of cards he has long known to be unbeatable. They comprised, he explained, a quantity of correspondence discovered in a locked cabinet at Sir Malcolm's own townhouse, obtained through a warrant which the magistrate had granted with some reluctance, given the gentleman's standing, but granted none the less upon the strength of Mrs. Bellamy's sworn statement. "You will see for yourselves," said Lestrade, spreading the letters before us upon the table. "Sir Malcolm borrowed a very considerable sum from the Bellamy estate some 20 years since, at a time when he was pressed for money in some speculation or other, and the debt was never properly recorded, still less repaid. Charles Bellamy knew of it, and appears to have said nothing during his lifetime, whether from friendship or from some arrangement between them I cannot say. But here," and he indicated a single sheet written in a hand I recognised from Holmes's earlier researches as Arthur Bellamy's own, "is a letter from Arthur himself, addressed to Sir Malcolm not 2 months before his confinement, in which he states, in the plainest terms, that unless the matter is restored, he shall place the complete account before the authorities." I read the words twice over, and confess they struck me with the force of a discovery that settles, at a single stroke, the whole architecture of a mystery. Here at last was a motive of the most elementary in human kind. An old debt, a threat of exposure, and a convenient asylum in which to silence the man who held the threat. "It writes itself, Mr. Holmes," Lestrade continued, with the satisfaction of a man who has laboured long and sees his labour at last rewarded. "Sir Malcolm arranges Arthur's confinement years ago, before the debt can be exposed, on some pretext of madness that his position on the asylum board makes easy enough to contrive. The matter rests quiet for 6 years. But something stirs it again. Perhaps Harcourt's talk of a possible release, perhaps some renewed inquiry from Mrs. Bellamy, and Sir Malcolm, fearing the whole story will now come out, forges the release order himself, or has it forged, and arranges for Bellamy to disappear for good this time, in circumstances that will make it appear the patient engineered his own escape." "You have evidence of the manner of his disappearance?" Holmes asked, though I thought his tone rather more measured than the occasion, in Lestrade's view, seemed to demand. "I have this," said Lestrade, producing a final item with evident relish. A brief note, unsigned, confirming that a package had been delivered to Blackthorn House from Sir Malcolm's own residence upon the very morning preceding Bellamy's release, carried by one of Sir Malcolm's own servants. I have spoken with the man myself. He confirms the delivery, though he cannot say what the package contained. We proceeded upon this intelligence to Sir Malcolm's townhouse that same evening, where we found the gentleman considerably altered from the confident figure who had received us at Blackthorn House some days before. He was pale, and his hands, when he rose to greet us, betrayed a tremor he could not entirely master. "I do not deny the debt," he said, when Lestrade had laid the correspondence before him without ceremony. "It is old history, gentlemen, and shameful enough, though I had believed it long buried with poor Charles. I borrowed the sum. I never repaid it as I ought, and Arthur discovered the matter and threatened me with it, precisely as that letter states. I will not pretend otherwise." "And the confinement?" Lestrade demanded. "I had nothing whatever to do with Arthur's confinement," Sir Malcolm insisted, though I confess his protest carried less conviction than I should have wished, given the gravity of the charge. "I was consulted as chairman of the board upon his admission, as I am consulted upon all admissions, but the medical judgment was Harcourt's and Morland's, not mine. I will admit that I did not press the matter of his release with any particular vigour once he was confined. I will admit that much, and I am not proud of it. But I never forged a document in my life, and as for the package—" He paused and passed a hand across his brow. "I sent medical books to Harcourt, gentlemen, nothing more, a gift in acknowledgment of some professional courtesy. I can produce the bookseller's receipt if you wish it." Lestrade received this explanation with the polite scepticism of a man who has heard a great many protestations of innocence in his career, and has learned to value them accordingly, and I confess that I too found Sir Malcolm's account somewhat thin, given the weight of circumstance now arrayed against him. The debt was real, the threat was real in Arthur's own hand. The package, whatever its true contents, had been delivered at precisely the moment the case required. It seemed to me, walking back through the darkened streets with Holmes at my side, that the chain of evidence had closed about Sir Malcolm with a completeness that left very little room for further doubt. I said as much to Holmes, and he received my observation with a silence that lasted the better part of 2 streets before he spoke. "It is a very complete chain, Watson," he agreed at last. "I do not dispute a single link in it. The debt is genuine, the threat is genuine, the package was genuinely sent. I have satisfied myself upon every point, and I find no fault whatsoever in Lestrade's reasoning so far as it extends." He paused beneath a street lamp, and I saw upon his face an expression I had learned, over the years of our association, to regard with particular attention, not the triumph of a man who has solved a case, but the unease of a man who suspects the case has been solved for him rather too conveniently. "The chain is irresistible, Watson, provided one accepts a single assumption that no one, in all our inquiries, has yet troubled to examine." "And what assumption is that?" "That the forged release order," said Holmes quietly, "was ever truly intended to release Arthur Bellamy at all." Chapter 8. The Number That Should Not Exist. I woke the following morning to find Holmes already seated at the table, the release order itself spread before him beside the copies he had made of the surrounding pages in Blackthorn's ledger, his breakfast untouched and cooling at his elbow in a manner that told me he had been at his labours since a very early hour indeed. "You have found something," I said, drawing up my chair. "I have found a number, Watson, which is a very small thing to have found, and which I begin to suspect may prove the largest thing in the whole case." He tapped the release order with a lean forefinger, indicating the registration figure entered at its head. 4176. You will recall that Crane explained to us upon our first visit that such numbers are assigned in strict sequence as orders are entered into the central ledger, each release following the last without gap or repetition, in the order of its occurrence. I recall it. I have this morning compared the entry against its neighbours. He drew forward the 2 copied pages and set them side by side. Here, entry 4175, an order dated the 3rd of November, quite unconnected with our affair, and here, entry 4177, an order for a patient named Whitfield, discharged upon medical recommendation. He paused, and I saw in his eyes that particular brightness which told me the significant point had not yet been reached. "The Whitfield order, Watson, is dated 2 days before Bellamy's supposed release." I confess it took me a moment to grasp the full weight of this observation, and Holmes, seeing my hesitation, explained the matter with the patient clarity he reserved for occasions when he judged a point too important to be left to inference alone. "If numbers are assigned strictly in sequence, as Crane assures us they are, then entry 4176 must have been created before entry 4177, since it precedes it in the numbering. Yet the document bearing that very number is dated 2 days after its supposed successor. The thing is a plain impossibility, Watson, upon the asylum's own system. A number cannot be assigned before its predecessor, and yet fall due after its successor, unless the ledger itself has been tampered with to make room for it." "The repaired page," I said, the recollection returning to me with sudden force. "The one you noticed upon our first visit to the records room." "Precisely so. I examined it again yesterday, with rather more thoroughness than our earlier visit allowed, and I am now satisfied that the page was removed entirely from its binding, altered to accommodate a new entry between 2 others where none had previously existed, and returned to its place with a skill that would have deceived any but the most exacting scrutiny. It is beautiful work, Watson, in its way. The gum matched almost precisely to the original. The ruling of the columns continued without a visible break. But the ink, when examined closely, shows a slightly different age from its neighbours, and no amount of skill can alter the plain arithmetic of a sequence once its foundation has been questioned. Then the release order was manufactured from within the asylum itself, I said slowly. The full significance of the discovery opening before me like a door long shut. Not by Bellamy, not by any outsider, but by someone with complete access to the ledger, the seal, and the registration system all at once. By someone, moreover, who possessed sufficient authority and familiarity to alter a bound and supposedly inviolable record without arousing the smallest suspicion in 15 years of daily use, Holmes added. There is only one man at Blackthorn House who answers so completely to that description, Watson, and I think you know already whom I mean. He rose, and crossing to the small table where he had laid out the fragment of cream paper discovered behind the radiator in Bellamy's abandoned room, took it up once more and turned it beneath the morning light with a care that suggested he had not yet exhausted its evidence. I sent a sample of this paper yesterday afternoon to an old acquaintance of mine in the trade, a dealer in fine stationery of 30 years' standing, and his answer reached me this morning by messenger. He produced a brief note and read from it. "The paper you have sent me," he writes, "is of a quality manufactured exclusively, so far as my records show, for legal chambers of the better sort, and bears a watermark I am able to trace with some confidence to a firm supplying stationery to Bellamy and Bellamy, solicitors, of Gray's Inn, during the period of approximately 8 to 15 years past." Holmes set the note down. "You will observe the dates, Watson. This is not Asylum paper, as I suspected from the first. It is paper from Arthur Bellamy's own former offices, of an age that places it squarely within the years when Silas Croft served as junior clerk to that very firm. The implications gathered before me with the swiftness of a fog lifting all at once to reveal a landscape whose true shape had been hidden throughout. He kept it, I said, kept it for years, against some future need, and used it now to manufacture the very evidence that would make Bellamy appear his own forger. So, I believe, Holmes said quietly, the handwriting practice left in the drawer, the sealing wax, the scrap of paper tucked just carelessly enough behind the radiator to reward a diligent search, all of it drawn not from any material available to a confined patient, but from a private store preserved by a man who had once served the very firm whose stationery he now turned to so ingenious a purpose. It is, I confess, as complete and patient a piece of misdirection as I have encountered in some years of this work, Watson, and I own a certain professional admiration for its construction, however much I deplore the use to which it has been put." He fell silent for a moment, gathering the scattered papers before him into a neat and orderly pile, and when he spoke again his voice had taken on the settled gravity of a man who sees at last the whole design laid bare before him, waiting only for its final confirmation. "We have established, I think, beyond reasonable dispute that the release order was forged from within by a hand intimately familiar with every particular of Blackthorn's administration. We have established that the evidence pointing toward Bellamy's own guilt was planted with materials that only a former clerk of his own firm could have possessed. There remains only one question of any real importance, Watson, and I mean to have it answered before this day is out. If Arthur Bellamy did not forge his own release, and did not flee upon his own initiative, then where, in the name of heaven, is the man now, and by whose hand was he taken from that room? Chapter 9. The Man Behind the Name. It was upon Holmes's own instruction that we gathered, upon the following afternoon, in the great consulting room at Blackthorn House, where our investigation had first begun, Sir Malcolm Vane, still pale and shaken from the ordeal of the preceding days, Dr. Harcourt, anxious and attentive, Dr. Morland, brisk and faintly impatient, as though he regarded the whole proceeding as an unwarranted claim upon his time, Mrs. Lydia Bellamy, seated apart from the others with her hands folded tightly in her lap, Inspector Lestrade, notebook in readiness, and, standing quietly near the door, as though he had not quite decided whether he was present as a witness or a participant, Mr. Silas Crane. Holmes stood before the cold hearth, and I do not think I had ever seen him address a gathering with quite so measured a gravity as he brought to the reconstruction that followed. "I must ask your patience," he began, "while I set before you a history considerably older than the events of this past week, for it is only in the light of that older history that the disappearance of Arthur Bellamy can be properly understood. He turned his gaze, briefly but unmistakably, toward the man standing near the door. 7 years ago, a junior clerk named Silas Croft served in the offices of Bellamy and Bellamy, solicitors, of Gray's Inn. In the course of his duties, he discovered that Charles Bellamy, the senior partner, had for some years been quietly diverting funds belonging to certain clients of the firm, among them the estate of Charles's own sister-in-law. Rather than expose this fraud, Croft chose to profit by his silence, and in time became party to it himself. Crane had gone very still, his face drained of what little colour it had possessed, but he said nothing, and Holmes continued. When Charles Bellamy died suddenly some 6 years ago, Arthur Bellamy, taking up the management of his brother's affairs, began to discover irregularities in the firm's accounts. He pursued the matter with the persistence of an honest man who suspects a wrong done to his own family, unaware that his inquiries threatened not only his brother's memory, but a former clerk who had every reason to fear exposure and ruin should the truth emerge. Croft, I believe, altered certain papers at this time so that suspicion, where it existed at all, should fall upon Sir Malcolm Vane, whose old and genuine indebtedness to the estate made him a scapegoat of the most convenient kind. Sir Malcolm at this gave a low exclamation, though whether of vindication or renewed distress I could not readily judge. Arthur continued his investigation nonetheless, Holmes went on, and Croft, growing desperate, took a further and more terrible step. Through carefully distorted statements, through correspondence quietly altered or invented, he contributed to a growing conviction among those around Arthur that grief for his brother had unsettled his reason. I do not say Croft alone contrived Arthur's confinement. I believe the family's own fears and the honest but mistaken judgment of physicians working from evidence that had been subtly corrupted played their part as well. But Croft's hand, gentlemen, lay behind a great deal of that evidence, and Croft's purpose throughout was his own protection. "This is monstrous," Harcourt murmured half to himself. "Some months after Arthur's confinement," Holmes continued, "a records clerk named Silas Crane applied for a position at Blackthorn House, and was engaged upon the strength of excellent, though, as we now know, substantially fabricated character references. It cannot, I think, be regarded as coincidence that the man who had contributed so materially to Arthur Bellamy's confinement should thereafter secure a position affording him constant access to the very institution in which his victim was confined, and to the records by which that confinement might be maintained, reviewed, or ended entirely at his discretion." Crane's composure had by now entirely deserted him, though he made no attempt to speak, standing rigid by the door as a man awaiting a sentence he has long anticipated but never quite prepared himself to hear. "Years past," said Holmes, his voice softening slightly, though without losing its relentless clarity. "Arthur's condition, whatever its true nature, appears genuinely to have improved under Dr. Harcourt's care, and Harcourt himself began, in recent months, to discuss the possibility of a formal review of his confinement. This was the moment Crane had, I believe, long dreaded. A restored and vindicated Arthur Bellamy, free once more and in full possession of his faculties, represented the gravest possible threat to a secret Crane had guarded for the better part of a decade. "And so he forged the release," I said, unable to contain myself further. "So he forged the release," Holmes agreed. "But not, gentlemen, in order to set Arthur Bellamy free. His purpose, from the first, was that Arthur should disappear under circumstances suggesting he had forged the document himself, and fled the country as a fugitive from an institution he had somehow deceived. To this end, Crane drew upon a private store of Bellamy and Bellamy's own stationery, preserved from his years in that firm's employment, to plant handwriting samples and a torn fragment of telltale paper in Arthur's room. He exploited, with a coldness I confess I find difficult to forgive, an innocent gift of medical books sent by Sir Malcolm to Dr. Harcourt, allowing that harmless parcel to appear in the light of later discoveries, as the vehicle of some sinister arrangement. And when the true history of Sir Malcolm's old debt came to light, as Crane must have known it eventually would, that gentleman's genuine but unrelated misconduct served only to complete a chain of suspicion that pointed everywhere but toward the man who had, in fact, constructed it. "Then where?" demanded Mrs. Bellamy, rising half from her chair, her voice trembling between hope and dread. "Where is Arthur now?" "Alive, madam," Holmes said, and I saw the relief break across her face like sunlight through parting cloud. "I have this morning located a small lodging-house in Camberwell, rented some weeks since under an assumed name by a gentleman answering to Mr. Crane's description, and paid for, according to the landlady, a full 3 months in advance. I believe we shall find Arthur Bellamy there now, held quietly until such time as the world had concluded he had fled abroad and ceased to trouble itself further with his fate." He turned, and I saw his eyes fall with quiet and terrible precision upon the watch chain at Crane's waist. "The key to that lodging, Inspector, has been hanging before us since the first day of our inquiry, polished by recent and frequent use upon a chain that Mr. Crane has doubtless found occasion to consult a good deal more often these past weeks than any of his ordinary duties could explain." Lestrade required no further encouragement. Crane, when the inspector's hand fell upon his shoulder, made no struggle whatever, but stood as though some long, sustained effort had at last, and almost with relief, been permitted to cease, and I thought, watching his grey and suddenly diminished figure led from the room, that I had rarely seen a guilty man surrender himself with less defiance and more exhaustion than Silas Croft, who had called himself Crane for so long that he seemed, in that final moment, scarcely to remember which name was truly his own. Chapter 10. The Order Restored. The lodging-house in Camberwell proved, when we reached it that same afternoon in company with Lestrade and 2 constables, a narrow and unremarkable building of the kind that draws no attention to itself in a street of 100 such houses, which I dare say was precisely the quality that had recommended it to Crane's purpose. The landlady, a stout and voluble woman who had known her lodger only as a quiet gentleman troubled in his nerves, led us up a flight of dim stairs to a small back room, and it was there, seated by a narrow window overlooking a yard of grey London brick, that we found Arthur Bellamy. He was thinner than the photograph Harcourt had shown us, and his eyes, when he turned them upon us, held the wary uncertainty of a man who has learned, through long and bitter experience, to trust nothing that presents itself as rescue. But when Mrs. Bellamy pressed past us into the room and took his hands in her own, I saw the wariness dissolve at last into something very like the relief of a man restored, after long exile, to a country he had feared he might never see again. "They told me nothing," he said, in a voice roughened by disuse, when he had recovered himself sufficiently to speak. "I understood only that I had been moved from Blackthorn, and that I must remain quiet, and that questions would answer themselves in time if I were patient. I did not know Crane's true history, Mr. Holmes, though I confess I had never trusted him, even in the old days at my brother's firm. There was always something in his manner too careful to be entirely natural." The weeks that followed brought a slow but thorough unwinding of the whole affair. A formal medical review, conducted by physicians drawn from outside Blackthorn's own establishment, concluded that whatever disturbance of mind Arthur Bellamy might genuinely have suffered in the immediate aftermath of his brother's death, his continued confinement across 6 long years had been sustained chiefly through evidence that closer examination now revealed to have been systematically corrupted at Crane's hand. He was pronounced, upon the fullest examination, entirely sound, and the stain upon his character, so far as only formal record could remove it, was accordingly lifted. Sir Malcolm Vane did not escape the consequences of his own conduct, though these proved in the end considerably narrower than the suspicion that had briefly threatened to engulf him entirely. The old debt to the Bellamy estate became public knowledge, to his very great and evident mortification, and he resigned his chairmanship of Blackthorn's board within the month, retiring from public affairs with what dignity he could still command. Holmes was careful, in his final report to Lestrade, to make plain the distinction that mattered most, that Sir Malcolm's financial misconduct, however genuine, bore no relation whatsoever to the crime that had actually been committed against Arthur Bellamy, save that Crane had found it a convenient shadow in which to conceal his own darker purpose. Dr. Harcourt, for his part, undertook a thorough reform of Blackthorn's administrative procedures, instituting a system by which no release order might henceforth be honoured without independent verification obtained directly from each signatory, and no single clerk, however trusted, permitted sole and unsupervised custody of the institution's official seal and registration ledger. It was, he told us when we called upon him some weeks later, a poor and belated remedy for the harm already done, but he meant it, he said, as some small assurance that Blackthorn House should never again become the instrument of a private vengeance so patiently and so cruelly pursued. Mrs. Bellamy took her brother-in-law from Blackthorn's grounds that same afternoon we found him, and I understand that he has since made his home with her and her children in a quiet house in Surrey, where he is, by all accounts, slowly recovering both his health and his interest in the ordinary business of living, though the years taken from him can never, of course, be restored by any verdict, however just. It was upon a quiet evening some fortnight after the case had closed that Holmes and I sat once more before the fire in Baker Street, the fog of that November now given way to the clearer, harder cold of approaching winter, and I found myself turning the whole strange history over in my mind with a persistence I had not been able to shake since Crane's arrest. "It troubles me still, Holmes," I said, "how very nearly we ourselves were deceived. The evidence against Sir Malcolm was genuine at every point. The debt was real, the threat was real, the delivery of the package was real. Had you not pressed beyond the surface of it, I think any court in England might have convicted him upon evidence that, in the end, proved to concern an entirely different matter altogether. That, Watson, was precisely the genius of Crane's design," Holmes said, drawing thoughtfully upon his pipe. "A lesser man, seeking to escape suspicion, invents an innocent scapegoat from whole cloth, and such inventions, however skilfully wrought, generally betray themselves upon sufficiently close examination, for there is nothing beneath them to sustain the weight of scrutiny. Crane did not make that error. He selected instead a man who was genuinely guilty of something, and allowed the natural momentum of that genuine guilt to carry the investigation wherever he required it to go. The deception did not lie in the evidence itself, which was almost entirely true. It lay in the direction toward which that evidence was permitted to point. Each fact encouraged us to stop looking, I said slowly, the pattern of it settling into place even as I spoke the words aloud. The debt was so damning that none of us thought to ask whether it truly explained the forgery or merely resembled an explanation closely enough to be mistaken for one. "You have put it better than I could myself," Holmes said, with something of the quiet warmth he reserved for those rare occasions when he judged my understanding to have kept pace with his own. "It is the great and constant danger of our profession, Watson, that a document, a fact, a piece of testimony does not become the truth merely because it points with sufficient force in a single direction. Men are forever mistaking the momentum of suspicion for the arrival of certainty. I have learned, across a good many years of this work, that the question worth asking is very rarely whether a piece of evidence is false in itself. It is rather, and always, why some person should have wished so very earnestly that we believe it." He fell silent then, and I did not press him further, content to sit in the familiar warmth of our old rooms while the fire settled and the lamps along the street below cast their steady glow against the darkening glass, reflecting, as they had done on so many such evenings, the quiet and enduring partnership of the two of us against whatever shadow London might next contrive to send our way.